I'm a big believer in second chances, even for people who commit serious crimes. Who deserves a second chance? Who gets one? And who decides? I'm Jessica Henry, and I'll be your host of Just Justice. I'm a former public defender, a professor of justice studies, and an award-winning author. And I'm excited for us to find new ways to put justice back into our criminal legal system. Hello and welcome to Just Justice. My name is Jessica Henry and I'll be your host. Hillary Blout is the founder and executive director of For the People, a national nonprofit working with prosecutors to look back at sentences and safely bring people home from prison. In 2018, Hillary drafted and secured the passage of California's AB 2942, the first prosecutor-initiated resentencing law in the country, and she's now leading its implementation. Hillary was previously a prosecutor for the San Francisco District Attorney's Office, where she was a fierce advocate for victims of crime, with a particular focus on crimes against women and children. Through her work at Californians for Safety and Justice, Hillary also promoted second chances for thousands of people previously convicted of lower-level felony offenses. Hillary has spoken around the country about the role of prosecutors in second chances. Her writing has appeared in national outlets such as the Washington Post and Newsweek. We're so excited to have you on the show. Welcome to Just Justice, Hillary.
Thanks so much for having me.
You were a prosecutor in San Francisco for many years. And we know, the Supreme Court has said that the prosecutor's job is to be a minister of justice. And part of the way that's been, translated in the American criminal legal system is the prosecutor is the person who has to prove a person's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. They get convictions and then they advocate for sentences, sometimes really long prison sentences. How did you, as a former prosecutor, come to the idea that second chances were an essential part of being a minister of justice?
It was a bit of an evolution in my own thinking. When I started out, I wanted to be a public defender. Where I grew up and what I saw as a kid, lots of friends going in and out of the justice system, lost a lot of friends to drugs and violence. And so I really thought that my calling was to be a public defender. I would be able to tell the stories of the people that I had known and grew up with that weren't bad people, but made bad choices. So it's very clear to me where I belonged in terms of reforming the system or working within the criminal justice system. But I was had an opportunity to observe a case involving a prosecutor and was able to see firsthand really the power that prosecutors hold in the justice system. And at the time, our now VP, soon to be President, Kamala Harris, was the district attorney at the time and was talking about things that were pretty foreign, about being smart on crime as opposed to tough on crime, and that it was the prosecutor's job to actually think about and ensure that people are successful when they come home from prison. So back to work programs and thinking about recidivism and reentry. So all of these things were happening in San Francisco, which were, nothing short of inspiring. And I really wanted to be a part of that. And I, for the first time, saw that there was a place for me with my own perspectives and experiences within the prosecutor's office. But the job is such that it can be a crushing load of cases that you're working on. And day after day after day, seeing so many Black and brown people coming in and out of the justice system, I had to enforce the law. That meant I had to hand down accountability that came in the form of punishment, which came in the form of incarceration. And that began to really affect me. And I began to question whether what we were doing was leading to the best outcomes. So that really got me thinking about, are there other ways that we could be achieving public safety? How are we even defining justice? The PDs define it one way, the DAs define it another, and maybe the community has a whole other definition of justice. So that's what really got me thinking about people that had been sent away do they need to stay in prison, or is there some other alternative to even prevent them from going in the first place? And then certainly something that should be happening on the back end. But when it became really crystal clear for me about second chances is I had an opportunity to work on an initiative in California, Prop 47, which was focused on people who had been serving time in prison for offenses that are now misdemeanors. So they would have an opportunity to petition and be released from prison. And also, all of the people who had formally received a conviction but were excluded from so many opportunities: housing, education, being a barber, being a volunteer at your child's school. I didn't know any of that as a prosecutor. I had no idea how the system was set up that created so many barriers for people to do what we wanted them to do, which is get out, don't commit offenses, get a job, be a good parent. And yet the system that we had was making it really hard for people to be successful. So even though I had been involved in sending people to prison, I felt very convinced that it was a responsibility that prosecutors should also hold.
That's really an arc, right? And I want to come back to that idea that prosecutors don't necessarily understand all of the consequences of a criminal sentence. So, not for the folks who are getting sent away for life, right? Because that's a different population, but the people, most of the folks who are just churning through the system through a revolving door, there are such huge consequences of having a conviction in terms of how they can re-enter society. So that's just huge. But before we even do that, I just kind of want to walk through exactly what it is that you're doing. And then I want to talk about all the other wonderful things that come out of that. So you were a prosecutor with Kamala Harris, and you sort of realized like, wow, maybe we could do something a little bit different. Not only did you think it, I mean, you took major action. You were one of the very first people to advocate for prosecutor-initiated resentencing laws. In fact, you wrote the very first one that got passed in California in 2018. So I'd love for you to explain, what is a prosecutor-initiated resentencing law? How did you decide that this idea that had been percolating in the back of your mind, like, hey, maybe we could do prosecuting a little bit differently? How did you think about making it into a law?
As I mentioned, I was working on this initiative and then working on implementing a new initiative for the state of California, which was to help people to get their records cleared so that they could access opportunities. Part of that was also supporting around people who were in prison that were serving for sentences that are now considered misdemeanors. And so in that, what we saw was it was public defenders, it was legal aid providers, there were grassroots community leaders, there were activists, there were people who were formerly incarcerated. There was this big, huge movement. Academia was involved to address these issues. But what was very absent from the landscape were prosecutors. They were sort of deemed as there's everybody else that's going to be responsible for making the changes that we need to see in our system. And then the prosecutors are going to be the ones that are going to be our opposition. But we're not going to engage them. We're not going to enlist them. We're just going to view them as we have to either replace them or we have to figure out how to work around them. And what struck me was that one, they hold so much power and it felt like we were leaving a lot on the table, but two, that they absolutely have a responsibility. So we're kind of letting them off and not having them, enlisting them and being involved in playing some role, right? I wasn't sure what role, but some role in terms of people that deserve second chances, and that if there is a way that we can make opportunities more seamless, that actually is the way that we're going to lead to safer communities. So all of that resonates with prosecutors, right? Their job is to be ministers of justice. Their job is also to keep our communities safe. That's how the idea started percolating, and it turned into what we have now, which is prosecutor-initiated resentencing. Was what is the area that I could reach out to prosecutors and start what I thought was going to be just a project? There were a lot of organizations doing amazing work trying to address over incarceration, mass incarceration. There were books that had been written that had come out, Brian Stevenson and Michelle Alexander. And so everybody was very focused on the fact that there were so many people that were in the carceral system, ranging from being in prison to on supervision or the collateral consequences of having a conviction on their record. So I knew that we needed to do something. I wanted to do something. And it felt like, given my background as being a former prosecutor, and because my perspective had shifted so much, because as you mentioned, there was so much I didn't know when I was a prosecutor. When a person was sent away, I sort of assumed that a person's going to get sent to prison and then the prison system is going to release them when they're rehabilitated. And that's just how the system in this other department of the criminal justice system works. And so when I found out that that wasn't happening, I felt compelled to want to do something. And I assumed that there's probably other prosecutors who are going to feel compelled to do something as well. So I spoke to friends that were still prosecutors, and I, not just going to progressive prosecutors, but actually going to colleagues that I worked with before that were kind of the hardcore prosecutors. And I just asked them, do you think that there are people in prison that don't need to be there? Do you think people can change after 10 years? If you knew that there were somebody in prison that had totally rehabilitated and just based on evidence, facts, it could be shown that they would be more of a benefit in our community than being in prison, would you want to be a part of getting that person out and reuniting them with their families? And every single prosecutor that I talked to said, well, that sounds reasonable. I believe people can change. I can think about some people that I prosecuted in my early days, and I wonder how that person is doing. But what I found was, in looking through the penal code, like, I must be missing something, because where's the section that says that the prosecutor, with as much power as they have to seek very long sentences, can also come back to court and say, Your Honor, I think the person should get a shorter sentence. I just assumed that there was something in the penal code that provided that mechanism. And everybody sort of shrugged and said, there's actually not a law that allows us to do that. That's when I decided to write that law. It's called prosecutor-initiated resentencing, and it's pretty simple. It's when a prosecutor makes a recommendation about a case that was prosecuted in their jurisdiction, it then vests the court with the jurisdiction to be able to revisit the case, and then the court will make the final decision about whether the person can be resentenced.
Why did you think, so you were not a prosecutor at the time, right, when you were advocating for this law? So why did you think that the best way to make this kind of change was to give the power to the prosecutor's office to request resentencing? Like, what was it for you that made you think, let's let the prosecutors make this request?
I was really looking for a way to use my experience as a former prosecutor, and also a way to engage prosecutors in this work. I believe that it is the role of the prosecutor to ensure that the sentences that they sought are just and fair, and not only at the time of the sentence, but 10, 15, 20 years later. I believe that that is their responsibility. So I wanted to create something that they could be ambassadors of, be proactive about, versus what I had heard and I had seen, which was mostly prosecutors in a reactive opposition posture to different types of reforms. The other thing that I wanted to honor was that prosecutors were saying that, because I asked them, what is it about this law or that law that you are so against? And thinking about how law enforcement has shown up year after year whenever there is any type of reform that's being proposed. Typically, there's lots of concerns about victims and how victims are treated through these processes, and that victims are seen as an afterthought. And that was something that prosecutors had said was really important to them. So creating something where they could be proactive in taking responsibility for ensuring that the people in prison that they sought to be there still need to be there. I thought that was important. And also that that they would also be able to engage victims in a way that they felt was going to be trauma informed and wouldn't be re-traumatizing of victims. The last conversation that a victim may have had was with the prosecutor telling them what the sentence was going to be. And so it felt like it could be more in keeping with how to engage victims by having the prosecutor contact them. There are other reforms, certainly, that have passed that are led by the petitioner or the judge has discretion. But I wanted to have something where the prosecutors would really be in the driver's seat because I think that the responsibility is something that they should own.
I think it's so interesting that the first prosecutors that you approached about this, even though sort of the quote unquote hardliners, were open to this idea. Did you feel like in talking about this law and sort of advocating for this law that you had a big educational component to your advocacy? Because I was really struck when you said that, you didn't understand as a prosecutor what some of these consequences were. And I think a lot of times people think, yes, this person's doing 20 to life. I'm making up a sentence right now, but they'll get out on parole. And they don't understand that parole has sort of stopped working in most jurisdictions. So people aren't getting out on parole, or they're, getting rejected from parole again and again. And so the sentences that were imposed wind up being the really long ones in certain cases. So did you feel like you really had an educational component to this work as you were trying to enlist prosecutors to your vision?
There's been an educational component, I think, throughout this whole entire process, and it comes up at different points. In the beginning, just asking the questions about would you support somebody that it is proven that they would be a benefit in our community? Would you support their release versus having them stay incarcerated? That wasn't really a hard education. I think it's pretty common knowledge that we're not who we were 10 years ago. So that was also something that was pretty easy. The education piece came from more how do you start this? How do you prove? How do I know that they've been rehabilitated? Like, what are we relying on? How do we get information? Do we get it from the defense? But the defense is going to give it to us in a advocacy way. It's not going to be everything. How do we trust that? Do we get information from the prison? Are we talking to the incarcerated person? Like, we don't do that. So it was a lot of how does this even work? And then if they get out, where do they go? Do they have housing? Who provides that? The questions were really more about the mechanics and not so much about the concept of really, doing the right thing.
Let's get into the mechanics because this is a really new idea, this prosecutor initiated resentencing law. What is the criteria for a person to have their case considered under a prosecutor initiated resentencing law? Are there exclusions for certain kinds of crimes? Are there a minimum number of years that a person has to have served before they can apply? I'm assuming there's an application, but tell us, how does a case get to be considered, or how does a person get to be considered for a prosecutor initiated resentencing?
The law is written in a way that it is discretionary. So the elected prosecutor can decide whether they want to engage in this work or not. They can also decide what the criteria is. So there are no exclusions at all. There's no carve outs in this. And so the elected and their office will make a determination about the kinds of cases that they want to review and how many based on, bandwidth or what their constituents have asked of them. It was really designed to make sure that the policy that was put out was going to be in responsive to the community that elected is there to serve. So those are kind of two of the overarching aspects of how the law works in practice.
When you say it's discretionary, does that mean, so for instance, in the state of California, where you sort of got the first national law passed, is there differences in counties? So if you're convicted in San Francisco versus convicted in a place like Pasadena or Santa Barbara, the availability of prosecutor resentencing actions is very different. Is that right?
So it does vary from county to county. There are some offices that have been more proactive in doing this work. They have been more engaged in it since the beginning. Some offices that have received funding to do this work, and others that have not prioritized this work at all. Similar to what you would see in other types of programs in the kind of criminal justice system. So certain diversion programs or certain conviction integrity efforts. I'm working on innocence cases. So it varies across the state, across the country. This law is not mandatory. It is, as I mentioned, it's discretionary. There are a couple of themes that we have seen across many of the offices that do this work. Most of them are looking at people who have served 7 to 10 years. They're looking for people who have a kind of trajectory of change, like recognizing that maybe in the beginning there's been some transition as the person was going into prison, but over the last 7 to 10 years, that there is some evidence that the person is taking different programs and completing educational courses. And there's enough there to show that, yes, this person is definitely not who they were when they were first sentenced. And there's more confidence in terms of whether the person can be safely released. So many of the offices will kind of look at a length of time that they've served at a minimum. The other thing that a lot of the offices have been looking for are, especially in California, people that are serving for third strike offenses. And so oftentimes we have a lot of people that we've supported where they had prior strikes when they were very, very young. They were maybe for something like a robbery, which is still a violent crime, but nobody was injured. It was a long time ago. And then they have a third strike, somebody in particular who was a felon in possession of a firearm on a bicycle and then gets a life sentence for that. And so 26 years later for that offense, they're looking at what the priors were and what the current offense was. And what they're looking at is to see, are we giving a life sentence to somebody who has committed the same offense that this person has been now serving 26 years? The other area is they're looking at people who are in the older population. So people that have sort of, quote, aged out. They're older now, lots of education. This kind of goes back to your question about education. We do a lot of education around adolescent brain development and sort of impulsivity issues. And so how many of those things are ameliorated as people are older. And so certainly with people in the elder population, there's just a very clear argument that those individuals have less likely to commit crime, and it's certainly with people that are, physical ailments, right? They're in walkers, they're in wheelchairs, and things like that. And then the last group is some of the younger people. So again, getting back to adolescent brain and the development there, people who were 14 when they committed their offense, they're now 24, 28 years old. They're certainly different than who they were when they were 14. So a lot of offices are prioritizing those groups as well. But many of the offices that are doing this work are also just, as requests come in, they're kind of looking at them, individually, one by one, and making determinations there.
I guess I'm still not quite understanding how somebody gets their sentence reviewed.
So some offices have, San Diego is one office in particular, and others across the state, they have on their website information for how to get the DA's office to review their case. And most of the offices will also have information about their specific criteria. Incarcerated people will write letters to the DA offices. They will also write letters to the public defenders. There's several community-based organizations around the state, especially in California, that are very equipped with supporting families on how to engage with the DA and how to lift their cases up to the DA. So there's a lot of different ways that cases are coming to the DAs. There's public defenders that will raise cases directly with the DA's office. There's also some offices, DA offices, that will ask internally, does anybody in this office have a case that they prosecuted that they want the case to be reviewed? One of the things that we do as an organization, and why we started our organization, was to support in the implementation of this law. What we do is we partner with DA offices, and we first structure agreements with them and also with the prison to first get data from the prison on everybody who's serving a sentence right now out of their jurisdiction. We clean up the data. We have a data scientist, and through looking at their data, We work with the DA's office to understand what their comfort level is on the cases they want to review, and we come up with a cohort together of people who are currently incarcerated. And then we, as an organization with our legal team, we will engage directly with incarcerated people. We send them pamphlets and guides that will serve as prompts to help them to articulate their transition and their growth and what to gather, and just, not try to hide the ball, but say to them, here are all the things that are going to inure in your benefit if we can understand more about why did you have that particular violation, right? Let's put it in context, or tell us more about what you've learned in the anger management courses. Tell us more about your relationship with your daughter. Send us copies of different certificates that you've picked up that we may not be able to get from looking at your prison records. And we gather this information and then we present it to the DA's office, and then they from there decide on the cases that they're going to advance. What we're trying to do, and have had some success in California, is to get offices on board with doing this cohort creation on their own. That's kind of the next frontier of this work. And several offices in California are already well underway with looking at their data, pulling cases from their data, and then advancing those cases on their own. But for those offices that have not started, both in California and also outside of California, we really see ourselves as stepping in that gap of how do I even begin? Where do I even start? And being able to show them the roadmap for how to bring cases in, how to evaluate them, and then how to get these cases back to court.
Once a case gets on the radar, once a prosecutor says, okay, we are on board with advocating for a resentence, and it gets to a hearing, does the person get assigned counsel? Is the person brought into court? And does a judge have to follow the recommendation of the prosecutor?
So it varies from state to state. Usually, when the person has been identified, if the DA office and the public defenders are already working in partnership on this initiative, which is happening a lot in California. Once cases are identified or people are identified and the DA is considering moving forward, the public defender will be assigned and begin working and supporting the person to gather their information, similar to what I mentioned that we do when we're working with DA offices. In some states, the public defender will not be appointed until the recommendation has been made. So until the recommendation has been made, the court does not yet have jurisdiction. And so until the court has jurisdiction to hold a resentencing hearing, they're not yet able to appoint counsel. So the appointment of counsel will sometimes happen at that juncture. But yes, they are entitled to counsel. They're getting counsel just at different points of the process. It varies from state to state. When the recommendation is made, the court can actually use the discretion that they have at that time. So they don't have to agree with the recommendation that's made from the DA. They can go above the recommendation. They can go below the recommendation. They can reject the recommendation. The law says that what they must do is that it has to be a lesser sentence. So the judge couldn't come in and say, okay, you got 26 years, but I'm going to now give you 30. So the only requirement of the judge is that the sentence has to be legal and the sentence must be lower than what it was at the original sentence.
You talked about victims, right? You talked about the idea that prosecutors are maybe best positioned to notify the victims and maybe represent the victims in some capacity. So what about victims? Do they have a role in the prosecutor-initiated resentencing laws?
Yeah, so the victims have a role similar to what they have on the front end. So in the beginning of a case, right, victims are engaged through the process. And when it comes to the sentencing, victims are informed about what the DA office is intending to do. They will certainly take into consideration the victim's posture and what they feel that they need to be made whole and feel safe. But the victim's perspective is not dispositive. It's not a plaintiff's case where they're deciding what the outcome is going to be. It's a similar posture on the back end. Some offices may make the determination that engaging the victim or after talking to the victim that a resentencing would be re-traumatizing such that it doesn't warrant the person getting released. But oftentimes what the offices are doing is engaging the victim, telling them about why the office is making this decision, or even actually before that, they engage and they say, we're considering going back on the case that you were a part of. And the reason that we're even doing this is because we've learned some new information about this person. And we believe that they've been rehabilitated, and we believe that they're no longer going to be a threat to public safety. And we want to tell you about what we're thinking before any decision has been made, which can be a bit unique for victims because oftentimes they get a notice in the mail that says, FYI, that person in that case is now getting released. And that can be very jarring. And so instead, the engagement looks a little bit different through this process. But usually the DA is taking that information under advisement and then stepping back and saying, okay, I serve the people. I'm not here to serve just this victim. What does public safety warrant? Do I believe the person can be safely released? And then the DA makes a decision from there.
You created this organization, this For the People organization. That's a nonprofit that's based in California, and that you've been advocating for prosecutor-initiated resentencing laws around the country. Can you tell us how's that going? Where else besides California have these laws been implemented, or have they been put under consideration?
The law was enacted, written in 2018, and then went into effect in 2019. And since then, we've seen a lot of activity across the country. The law has been replicated now in several other states. So Washington State, Oregon, Illinois, and then most recently, Minnesota. We've also seen the law proposed in several states: Florida, Texas, Vermont, Michigan, Georgia, just to give you a flavor for the activity that we're seeing around these laws being passed in other places. We also support some places where they don't have a law like this on the books, but they have other kinds of legal mechanisms, maybe narrower, maybe with more carve outs. So we also support those offices with the same kind of support that I mentioned, which is helping them get their prison data, helping to look to see who is in prison that might fall within the categories of the laws that they have in their state, and then interfacing with incarcerated people to just gather more information. Because in all of these, it's always going to be, can this person be safely released? It's always going to be a public safety question, in addition to the other elements that some of these other laws have. This bill is pending in Utah right now, in Michigan right now. So we believe that through the education of how this law works in practice, and also in continuing to elevate the stories of people that have come home, that it has a real opportunity for making its way into some of the more conservative states, or some of the leaders that you wouldn't think that would be on this side. We have a lot of conservative partners that, when they hear about how much money is spent, it's $120,000 per person per year in California. There's a recognition that that money could be spent in other ways. I don't want to act like everybody just loves this and they want to have this law in every state. That's certainly not the case, but it does seem that when we have an opportunity to explain the mechanics, explain what we've seen, right? When they can hear from other practitioners about what they've been doing, and these are prosecutors that are career prosecutors, been doing this for almost 30 years. It does seem like there is definitely an appetite for more of these laws and this work across the country.
That is amazing, right? Finding that commonality across the sort of the perspectives on crime is really so important, right? Because at the end of the day, people want to be safe. But how we define that and how we define what's needed is, may vary considerably. So it's so important that you're able to engage such different partners. Within the states, is a prosecutor initiated resentencing law? Is that the only mechanism? Or is the vision that we won't have other types of second look laws, or we wouldn't have parole? This would be the exclusive resentencing mechanism, or is it supposed to operate in connection with all the rest of the ways that we that exist, at least on the books, to get people a second chance?
We really conceptualized prosecutor-initiated resentencing to be a complement to other types of reforms or other types of mechanisms that are in place. So it is not a substitute for parole. There are a lot of people who are not eligible for parole because they have a 100-year sentence. We had a gentleman that we supported with his resentencing work who, was in his 70s when he came home, but was 20 years away from getting before parole. So we see it as a complement, as another tool to be able to identify the people that don't need to be in prison, get them home, get them working, get them paying taxes.
If you had to guesstimate, how many folks have actually obtained a new sentence?
So we have done, I mean, and it is not a robust data pull. One of the things that has been challenging is that not all prisons are sort of designating the resentencing as a prosecutor led or prosecutor initiated or prosecutor was in support of. And many of the DA offices are also not having a tracking system to delineate these are the ones we did in this way. We have basically, we call offices, we ask them, if you're tracking it, what are your numbers? And so what we have learned over the last couple of years in doing this is that it's getting close to 1,000 people that have been resentenced, but we think that number is a pretty severe underestimation, but that gives you a sense of the volume. This is not 10, 15 people that we're talking about. We're talking about 1,000 people, and this is from across the country. Certainly the largest number of people that have been resentenced came out of California. We've been doing it the longest. Our organization is housed in California. There was funding that came to California to support this work, money that went to the public defender's office, the DA offices, and community groups. So we've definitely had a head start, and we've had some resources built in, and we've had some really strong DA champions from across the political spectrum. All the other states can be doing this work the way that California has been doing it, and that's what we're hoping to see.
Prosecutor-initiated resentencing laws are not without controversy, right? And so I just wanted to float two questions that I've seen come up when people have heard about these prosecutor-initiated resentencing laws. And the first is that, some people think, okay, this sounds good in practice, but it's so dependent on the elected prosecutor and whether they're willing to use their power. And so because it's so dependent on electoral politics and on individual personalities that can change with any election cycle, does it make sense to make it an integral and important part of second chances?
I still believe that it is critical that the DAs are playing a proactive role in addressing the prison population, the people that they have sentenced, and having an eye towards recognizing a person's humanity and the potential for change. And that when they see that and they remember and have a fuller picture of a person, that it is their responsibility to do something that is proactive. I think that there was a lot of critique of this in the beginning from all sides, quite frankly, that you're not going to get prosecutors to do this. You shouldn't have prosecutors doing this. Everything should be petitioner led or should be much more open. And the reality is that in some states, getting something like prosecutor-initiated resentencing passed is a challenge just to give prosecutors the ability to bring cases back to court. So it would be, I think, a lot more challenging to get something passed that was broader. And so we're trying to be responsive to the fact that the system is designed in a way where it will pull several people into the justice system, and it makes it very difficult for people to get out, right? It is a very, very, very narrow pathway to get out of prison. And there are lots of ways for people to get pulled into prison. And so we recognize that making this kind of avenue more open, right, is a challenge in and of itself. And so where other advocates may be able to get something passed that is more broad, that's great. Godspeed. But there is a real recognition that the changes on the back end will necessarily, in some places, need to be incremental. And so it is both of those things at play, the recognition that some of these changes may need to be incremental, and two, that I believe that when you give more power to a prosecutor, right, with that comes the obligation and the responsibility, which is, I think, something that prosecutors should be holding and leading, which is getting people out of prison who are better served in our community.
And that was actually the second critique, if you will, that I've seen, which is just that resentencing power shouldn't be in a prosecutor's office, given how powerful prosecutors are today. People have sort of said prosecutors are now the most sort of important, powerful person in the courthouse. Giving them additional power just feels like it's tipping the scale too far.
Yeah, and I just think that it's more of a theoretical argument, right? What would be the downside of giving a prosecutor power to get people out of prison? The power is not used in any other way but for getting people out of prison. So it's more of a, we don't want to give prosecutors more power. It doesn't matter what kind of power it is. We just have a belief system that says no more power to prosecutors. And I think it is short-sighted, quite frankly. And it doesn't really apply here because the power that they're given is to do the right thing. I've certainly talked to enough people that, advocates that have been doing this work far longer than I have, people from the defense community that have been working in a court system and have not always had the best experience working with prosecutors. So I can certainly understand this philosophical stance that says we don't want to give prosecutors any more power, even if the power is to do something good. The need is so high for the number of people that need relief who are in prison. And I just feel like we cannot let a philosophical disagreement about giving prosecutors power to be the stumbling block for us to get people home from prison who don't need to be there anymore. If we've got a pathway to get them out, we need to get them out. And if you ask people in prison if they care about the philosophical disagreement, they'll say no. They'll say, get us home, get whoever you can get home as quickly as you can. So I'll take direction from them. And I recognize that it is crazy, and it was crazy that you're going to try to get the person that put him in prison to get him out, but it's working. And prosecutors are changing the way that they're thinking about how they spent their career, decisions that they made when they were, early on in their career as a prosecutor. They're starting to think differently about young people that they prosecuted because they're looking back at a person now in their 30s and they're able to see the whole entire picture. We spend a lot of time focusing on the drivers that led the person there to contextualize why the work that they've been doing today is so meaningful. Like, why does it matter? Because it addresses the drivers that led them to commit the crime.